Good evening, I'm John Becker.
And I'm Robin Wilhoit. It is a decades-old tradition, placing flags on grave sites for Veterans Day.
But volunteers who perform that service at the East Tennessee State Veterans Cemetery have been told it actually breaks a rule. 10 News reporter Hillary Lake is in our information center to explain. Hillary?
That's right, Robin and John. The man in charge of placing the flags every November 11th says he was surprised to learn it violates a federal rule that state cemeteries follow.
This is where my father, Everett S. Phillips, is laid to rest, as well as my mother.
Army veteran Rick Phillips's connection to the East Tennessee State Veterans Cemetery runs deep.
They've allowed me to live my life in freedom and hopefully allow me to die in freedom as well.
What might die is an effort Phillips has coordinated for the last 20 years.
It's just a magnificent sight.
Placing these American flags at every gravesite for Veterans Day.
The Tennessee Department of Veterans Affairs, through Bill Griffin, the director here at the cemetery, said we would not put the flags out.
Griffith says he was not allowed to talk on camera for this story. Phillips says the VA has decided to enforce part of the federal floral arrangement rules posted in the cemetery. Small flags are only to be put up for Memorial Day.
We will be the only cemetery in the state of Tennessee that will be allowed to do that.
Phillips took matters into his own hands. He appealed to the state VA and was granted a one-time waiver for the flags this year.
It probably won't happen next year unless, the people of Tennessee lobby their legislatures.
Phillips says he isn't sure why the state decided to enforce the rule after all this time, and the thought of no flags next year has some volunteers upset.
A federal regulation that does not allow flags on grave sites in a veteran cemetery on Veterans Day is ridiculous.
It's not dishonoring our veterans, but it's forgetting our veterans.
Flags will honor local veterans this year, including Phillips's father, but they also might mark the end of an era. Now, we did contact the VA in Nashville, but did not get a call back. Next year's Veterans Day ceremony will go on, Mr. Phillips says, even if it's without the flags. And volunteers are still needed to put flags out tomorrow for this year's ceremony on Thursday. Anyone interested in helping should be at the cemetery off of Lions View Pike at 3 p.m. Robin and John?
Well, let's hope we get some answers. Thank you, Hillary.
Straight from the heart of East Tennessee, this is 10 News at 6.
I think that's the most ridiculous thing I've ever heard in my life.
Area veterans, their families, and lawmakers are speaking out tonight after learning that federal regulations don't allow headstone flags in the state veterans cemetery on the holiday that honors those buried there. Good evening, I'm Robin Wilhoit.
And I'm John Becker. We first told you about this story at 11 last night, letting you know those flags will go up this year because of a one-time exception. But 10 News reporter Brittany Bailey is in our information center with more on one lawmaker's effort to change the rules for good. Brittany?
That's right, John and Robin. Congressman Jimmy Duncan saw our story and took action, writing a letter to the VA in Washington.
It's just so brilliantly beautiful. It honors those that have honored us.
A long-standing tradition is underway once again here at the Tennessee Veterans Cemetery, but just barely. And despite the federal floral regulations that only allow flags on the graves during Memorial Day.
It's just not logical to have a rule against flying the flag anywhere, no less in a solemn, natural, national environment such as this is, on such hallowed ground. It just doesn't make sense.
It all started when, just like in years past, the cemetery director asked the state for the okay to put up the flags on Veterans Day. But this year, the rules were strictly enforced by this man, who is new to the position.
When I received the request, I researched the rules and followed the rules.
Word spread and frustration mounted, making its way to the office of Congressman Jimmy Duncan.
Whether it's a state cemetery or a federal cemetery, this rule makes no logic, has no logic to it. To allow flags to be placed on the graves during Memorial Day, but not on Veterans Day, makes no sense whatsoever.
An appeal led to a waiver for this year.
I cannot predict the future, but I think if the proper actions are taken, that it could possibly happen.
Congressman Duncan is still waiting to hear back from VA officials in Washington, but he has said if necessary, he would introduce legislation to change those rules. John and Robin.
Taking action. Brittany, thank you.
Volunteers helped place more than 5,000 flags at the Veterans Cemetery this afternoon. Veterans, Boy and Girl Scouts, and the Young Marines, here you see on the screen now, have all made it an annual event. However, this year, many more volunteers show up to support. They saw our story last night and turned out. The crowd started rolling in 2 hours early. And tonight on the Night Beat, you will hear from a soldier and a Cub Scout about what this tradition means to them.
Good evening. I'm Robin Wilhoit.
And I'm John Becker. The East Tennessee State Veterans Cemetery is lined with American flags tonight. More than 100 volunteers placed one at each grave this afternoon.
But many are worried the annual event will be canceled next year. As we first told you last night, volunteers learned they weren't technically allowed to place flags on the graves at the cemetery. That's because federal rules only allow the flags on Memorial Day.
This time, volunteers got a waiver, but Congressman Jimmy Duncan says he'll introduce a bill to change the rule if he has to.
This afternoon, some volunteers arrived at the cemetery 2 hours early to place the flags on the grave sites.
They told 10 News reporter Stoney Sharp how they feel about that controversial rule. Stoney?
Robin and John, unhappiness could be measured by attendance this afternoon. Normally, the flags are placed by local veterans, Boy and Girl Scouts, and the Young Marines right before Veterans Day. This year, many unfamiliar places helped with honoring the veterans.
It teaches him how to properly respect and honor those who have served our country. I'll let you hammer it.
It's a lesson that Dean Newton has hammered into his son for the past 4 years.
Let's go to the next one. I could never imagine Veterans Day without the American flag. Again, it's just another way that we can serve those who served us.
Because it's honoring everyone who has served, and it's honoring America.
Sloan Newton is just in the 4th grade. He already has a deep appreciation for veterans.
They have kept us a free country. They have kept us how we are right now.
Placing flags by these graves before Veterans Day is an annual tradition for the pair and their Cub Scout group.
It makes me feel like I've done enough for my country.
This year, the number of volunteers doubled. People learned that the flags almost didn't fly.
I checked them out of school early because I wanted them to understand the importance of this day.
They want to send a strong message to Washington that American flags should be allowed on veterans' graves, inside veterans' cemeteries, on more occasions than just Memorial Day.
I do not think that it's fair that if a soldier can give his life for his country, that he can't have a representation of what he died for sitting in front of him 365 days out of the year, if so be.
Change, they hope, is hammered in place before next Veterans Day.
I think they need to rethink that law and think it through.
And volunteers will gather again to remove the flags at 3 p.m. on Friday. Robin and John.
Amazing that turnout there. All right. Thank you, Stoney. We have been telling you about this story all week where American flags have become controversial.
10 News reporter Emily Stroud has more from our information center. Emily?
Well, John and Robin, thanks to volunteers, flags marked each grave, and they hope their tradition will continue despite federal law. But the flag flap took a back seat today. Instead, a Knoxville doctor who fled Korea with his family thanked veterans this afternoon at the East Tennessee State Veterans Cemetery. Dr. Tom Kim was just 6 years old when his family came to the United States. He designed a medal to honor their service and presented those medals to the veterans. Volunteers placed about 5,000 flags on the tombstones at the cemetery. They got a 1-year waiver on the enforcement of a federal regulation allowing American flags only on Memorial Day.
We think it's going to be resolved permanently in the very near future. So, and that is something that can be done in Nashville. That doesn't have to be done in Washington.
They'll take the flag issue to the new state veterans commissioner, whoever incoming Governor Haslam selects. Now, if that doesn't work, then Congressman Jimmy Duncan said he plans to pursue a legislative change. John and Robin?
A lot of people for pushing this forward then. All right, Emily, thank you.